Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here. It's a distinct honor to be here with the Madina Institute, an organization that I really commend and really share the same progressive values, doing really transformative work in this city, but also cities across the country. What a time to be alive, right? It's an exciting time, a turbulent time, a lot going on within our community, a lot going on beyond our community. I got here last night, and I understand the significance of Little Rock with regard to where it stands in the civil rights landscape and history of this country. It's a city where the freedom rides came in and helped progress and propel the civil rights movement forward. It's a place where boycotts were held. It's a place where the very civil rights that we enjoy today as Muslim Americans, which are being gradually retrenched by this Trump administration, was established by civil rights giants like Martin Luther King, by civil rights giants like John Lewis and Bayard Rustin, whose shoulders we stand on today, shaky shoulders because of what the Trump administration has done, but shoulders that we nonetheless must commend and build on as we move ahead. It was the gravity of the city really. I went for a run this morning, and the real weight of the city and the gravity of the city really sunk in. So I really appreciate being in this city here today to talk about my book, but also to theorize and hopefully to reveal what Islamophobia actually means. It's a term that has become very popular and very prominent in recent years because of what's happening in this country. But it's also a term and a phenomenon that many people don't know very well. It remains very ambiguous. It remains very gray. It remains very vague. So my objective with this talk, inshallah, is to provide you with a really solid framework and a really solid understanding of what it means, so then we can go on and then educate our friends, our family members, our colleagues, and our classmates about this threat of Islamophobia. I'd like to start off by talking about the genesis of this book and what drove me to write this book. I started writing this book, formally speaking, roughly 3 to 4 years ago, but spiritually speaking, 15 to 20 years ago. I was a high school student. I was a wayward high school student. I wasn't somebody, the Muslim parents in the room might be disappointed. I wasn't a good student. You know, I wasn't one of those students that was going to become a doctor, so I disappointed my mother and my father at an early age. I was a boxer. I had a love for athletics. But I recall the day in which I finally learned what it is I wanted to do with my life. I read a book called Out of Place by a very prominent Palestinian-American intellectual named Edward Said. Edward Said, who was Palestinian but also Christian, in my opinion, is the most effective voice against anti-Muslim animus in what we know as Islamophobia today in the history of this country and perhaps the history of the world. He wrote these words that really gave me direction and provided a compass for what it was I wanted to do with my life. I am an Oriental writing back at the Orientalists who for so long thrived upon our silence. Now at that juncture, I didn't know what Orientalism meant. I didn't know that Orientals, he meant to mean Arab and Muslims. But what I did know when I turned on the television, that Muslims were only being showcased and talked about when we were victims. We were never being talked about when we were villains, when we were terrorists, when we were committing atrocity across the country and in this country. We were never talked about when we were victims. And I also realized that the voices on television, the faces on television, did not look like me. They did not share my name. They weren't named Muhammad or Khalid or Fatima or Zainab. They were largely white men looking to defame and defile Islam on news television. So I realized at that juncture that I wanted to be a voice, and a transformative voice, hopefully, that can shed real light and disentangle these misrepresentations about who Muslims were. And that opportunity came in real time, roughly 4 years ago, when Trump, for the first time, started talking about this proposal, which came to be known as the Muslim ban. December 7th, 2015, I remember that date distinctly. And I was the first law professor in the country who was called to campuses across the country to talk about what this travel ban or Muslim ban might actually mean. How would it impact Muslim communities in this country, immigrants, asylees, refugees, seeking to come into this country. Recall, this was a time when there was great strife in places like Syria and Iraq. Considerable numbers of refugees were coming into the country. Went to places like New York, where I had the opportunity to meet young Muslim men and women like Lamia, who talked about how this ban had domestic ramifications. It wasn't only something that had an impact on the immigration front, it was something that was inciting violence, emboldening mob violence to commit hate crimes and hate incidents against individuals who looked Muslim. I met Jamal actually at a boxing gym. Again, I told you earlier, I'm a former boxer, young black Muslim guy who talked about how his identity placed him at this very dangerous intersection where he was being policed on account of his blackness, but at the same juncture being surveilled on account of his Muslim identity. And most memorably, and this is what I preface the book with, was an experience I had with a young Latino male who was my Uber driver, ironically enough, after a talk that I gave at Cal State LA, near downtown LA. Now, Juan was telling me as we were driving through, that horrific traffic that can be had in Los Angeles, about his objective and his desire to embrace Islam, but he feared that his status being undocumented, he feared that living in Pico Union, a community near downtown LA, which is heavily policed by ICE, and in conjunction with those two identities, converting to Islam would place him at this very difficult intersection, this trying crucible, where those three identities could lead to deportation. These were the faces that I met, these were the stories that I heard at a very tumultuous and turbulent time in this country's history, where this proposal coming from the president would in fact become law and be upheld by the Supreme Court years later. And it was incumbent upon me, in fact, more than incumbent, it was an obligation that I wrote a book. It was an obligation that I translate all this academic work I conducted for years into a package that could resonate and reach lay people, Muslims, non-Muslims, and to speak to the trials and the tribulations that we were facing in real time. Now, while I was writing this book, I was also closely reading the Quran, closely reading my favorite author, an author I'd recommend everybody read, James Baldwin. Wrote a brilliant book called The Fire Next Time, and he wrote these words: "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive and who had ever been alive." What those words really revealed is that our struggles were not exceptional. They were not unique. If you look at this country's history, you see that a broad range of racial and religious minorities face the same challenges, and it was critical for me to write a book that connected our experiences with experiences of those past and those moving ahead. So with that said, what is Islamophobia? What is this term? What is this concept? What is this phenomenon that we all know, that rolls off the tip of our tongues so seamlessly, yet there's so much ambiguity as to what this term actually means? Now, what I do for a living, I'm a constitutional law professor. I have the privilege of teaching roughly 120 students almost every day about the Constitution. And people typically ask me, Khalid, what's the most impactful thing you do as an activist or as a scholar? It has nothing to do with Islamophobia. It has everything to do with teaching the Constitution as a brown Muslim male to majority white students who have gone on to become judges, have gone on to become lawyers and politicians, and so on and so forth. I take great pride in the fact that they learn about this country's Constitution from somebody who looks and believes like me. And I always lead the class with teaching my students about the First Amendment. The First Amendment is comprised of two clauses which are called the religion clauses, and it's key to understand that Islamophobia is tied to these religion clauses in a very interesting way. First, The language of the clause reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which means that there has to be separation of church and state, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which means that the state or law cannot restrict and encumber how individuals practice their religion. Now, when we understand what Islamophobia is, we understand that Islamophobia is placing the free exercise clause on its head. Because what Islamophobia essentially is the more that Muslims express, outwardly manifest their religious identity, the more they become suspicious to the state and the more they become vulnerable to hate mongers. So the first thing you have to understand is the First Amendment is denied almost categorically as a consequence of how Islamophobia is manifested. So in my academic research, the first thing that I wanted to address is that the existing definitions of Islamophobia that were percolating in the press, that were being voiced by activists, that were becoming prominent in the political and the popular discourse, were in fact too short-sighted. They weren't addressing what was actually going on in this country. Islamophobia is more than just a rational fear or aversion to discrimination against Islam or people who practice Islam. It's more than just dislike or prejudice against Islam or Muslims. It's more than just a network of institutions, politicians, and pundits. These definitions, which prevailed as the most prominent definitions, they provided you with a sliver of an understanding of what Islamophobia is, but we're still far too narrow and not as robust. So I took it upon myself and I wrote this article in the Columbia Law Review, an academic journal, defining Islamophobia for the first time within legal scholarship. And I define Islamophobia as the presumption that Islam is inherently violent, alien, and inassimilable, driven by the belief that Islamic identity is tied to terrorism, which unravels in three forms and three sort of dimensions. This is kind of the lecture portion of the presentation. I want everybody to really absorb this so that we can go on and become ambassadors and become teachers in our respective communities. Three forms of Islamophobia that I'll walk through really closely. First, we have private Islamophobia. Next, we have structural Islamophobia. And finally, we have dialectical Islamophobia. Before we can talk about Islamophobia, we go back to Edward Said, the man who inspired me again to want to do this work, wrote a really important book, one of the most transformative books of the 20th century, in fact, called Orientalism. Orientalism was this master discourse in which Said said that the West defined itself. The virtues it attached and ascribed to itself were in mirror opposite terms of the Muslim world being the Orient, right? If the West was the haven for democracy, if it was the hub of liberal principles, if it was where forward thinking and civilization and peace was prospering and flourishing, then the Muslim world had to be everything but. It was backwards, it was static, it was tyrannical, it was patriarchal. It was a region in a space that was moving backwards while the West was continually moving forward. And it's critical to understand that Said, Orientalism, this master discourse, forms the foundation. It's the mother of understanding Islamophobia. Before we can understand what Islamophobia is, as a menace, as a phenomenon, it's critical that we grapple with understanding the tropes, the stereotypes that are deeply seated in this country's imagination and its legal system by this precedent discourse called Orientalism. And the very moment in which Islamophobia is born are the 9/11 terror attacks. This is when Islamophobia becomes a robust institution in structure and enacted by the Bush administration through the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and other strident and sweeping policy. So when we talk about Islamophobia, again, key to root it in the system of Orientalism. Next, we have private Islamophobia, which is the form that the media tends to hone in on and that people generally understand. This is fear, suspicion, and violent targeting of Muslims by individuals. And we see this happening in real time through the vandalizations and attacks and arsons on masajid, on attacks on visible Muslims, on the murders of the 3 students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We also saw it very vividly and starkly in New Zealand with the murder of 51 victims who were praying on Jum'ah at the El Nur and Linwood Mosques in Christchurch. An individual who said he was inspired by Trump to enact vigilante violence in real time at these mosques. Next, we have structural Islamophobia, which is Islamophobia enacted and extended by policy and law. Laws like the Patriot Act, laws like the travel ban, laws like anti-Sharia bans, which are really prominent in states like Arkansas and in the South, which I consider to be the most nefarious form of Islamophobia. As a law scholar, as a former lawyer, I can tell you that the law is what actually emboldens and inspires individuals to commit these hate crimes and this hate violence. So when we think about Islamophobia, it's really essential for us to think about it being spearheaded by law and by policy. And critical to know that, one common stereotype and trope is that we tend to think about Islamophobia as being a menace that is only coming from the right? It is only something being inflicted and unleashed by Republicans and conservatives. That is in fact a misnomer. Once we look at the structure and the anatomy of the war on terror, we see that it's a project that was initially established by the Bush administration, but then carried forward by the Obama administration by way of additional policies like counter-radicalization policing. And then finally we see in its most brazen form with the Trump administration and clearly reaching its climax with the enactment of the travel ban. You guys might recall when Trump, remember that orange-skinned candidate, December 7th, I think it was a speech he gave in Iowa, said, "I'm going to ban Muslims until we know what's going on." You turn on the television. I was interviewed by Anderson Cooper a day later, and he asked me, "Professor Beydoun, this really can't happen, can it? This is against the Constitution." And I stepped back and I thought, it could. There's precedent in this country for banning Muslims. There's precedent denying naturalization of individuals along lines of religious identity and racial identity. So a proposal that was peddled by an orange-skinned candidate actually became a policy that was confirmed and carried forward by the highest court in the land. The most destructive form of Islamophobia, in my opinion, and I come from Detroit. Detroit is, you may know, one of the most concentrated and biggest Muslim communities in the country. A form of Islamophobia that we seldom talk about and that more of us know little about, called counter-radicalization policing. This is when law enforcement seeds informants, spies within our mosques, spies within our schools. It looks to entrap individuals, young people online, to effectively keep tabs on their imams, to keep tabs on their friends, to keep tabs on their classmates, to assess if what they're doing is tied to terrorism. So this structure of Islamophobia is far more nuanced, far more menacing and ominous than we might think it is. Next, we have dialectical Islamophobia, which is when the law is inciting and authorizing violence on the part of angry mobs. So it's no surprise that when Trump says, "I think Islam hates us," we kind of brush that off as being merely rhetoric, right? Rhetoric by an aberrant and by a deviant president. However, it's key to know that this rhetoric is ammunition, right? This rhetoric is actually moving, it's actually authorizing and emboldening individuals on the ground, vigilantes, mobs, mercenaries, to commit a whole range of hate crimes and hate incidents that make our communities, our loved ones, our young ones, vulnerable to violence in a very serious way. Now, I feel worked up. I don't know why. I think I drank some coffee beforehand. Maybe that run got me all excited and inspired. I feel like this is a cardio workout going on. Okay. Now, my next book, the next book I'm inshallah working on right now is a book talking about how Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. What's happening here in the States with this extension and this protraction of the war on terror has global ramifications, and what's happening on the domestic front is almost happening in more ominous and destructive ways on the global front. We see what's happening in China, where Beijing has placed as many as 3 million Muslims in concentration camps. Now, I gave a speech a couple weeks ago at Columbia University. A large segment of the audience were Jewish brothers and sisters, right? They came up to me afterwards and they told me, you know, we thought Auschwitz, we thought these concentration camps were obsolete, that they were a thing of the past, a relic of a bygone era. If you look to China, you see in real time how up to 3 million Muslims are being locked away in these camps, forced to work as slaves, women raped, people force-fed alcohol and pork. Islamophobia in its most wretched form. We also see Islamophobia globally in what's happening with our sisters and brothers in Myanmar. Up to 2 million Muslims, indigenous Muslims, being pushed out of their homes, their communities, as a consequence of religious identity. Now, the funniest thing to me, I don't like doing interviews on news anymore. I reject like 80% of them. Because the funniest thing to me is that they always want to conflate Islam with violence, right? That Islam is uniquely the only religion that is inspiring violence. But if you look to Myanmar, you see that Buddhist nationalism is inspiring violence against Muslims. Again, going back to the initial quote that I gave you, Muslims are only newsworthy when we're villains. I don't see a lot of news about these Rohingya Muslims, do you? Until recently, now that it's in the UN. You also see Islamophobia globally in India. India is actually home to the second biggest Muslim population in the world. 201 million Muslims facing the onslaught by the Modi regime, which in many respects is emulating the Trump administration. So once you understand that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, you see that what the government does over here is actually inspiring and encouraging governments abroad to commit, again, heinous crimes against individuals on account of their religious identity. We passed the Muslim ban here. Modi is keen on enacting his own Muslim ban, restricting Muslim immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens in what they like to call the biggest democracy in the world, right? Doesn't seem and look too democratic to me in these days. Okay, with all that said, right, all this difficult, sad, bleak, ominous stuff going on across the world, we gotta have hope, and more than just hope. Hope is passive. When you say we gotta have hope, that's actually a passive emotion. You gotta build on hope. We gotta be proactive. We gotta have zeal. We gotta take advantage of what we have here. The Constitution is a beautiful, brilliant document because it equips us with a range of rights. We gotta meet hope halfway with the rights that are enacted and extended to us by this Constitution. So like Sister Sophia told us earlier, Islam is the fastest growing religion in this country. Whether it's birth rate, whether it's conversion, whether it's inward migration, statistics and growth are meeting and colliding with this hate that's rising from the White House in places beyond. In addition to being the fastest growing religion, Islam is the most diverse faith group in this country. I did an interview a couple weeks ago with NPR, and the host asked me, so how do you feel about the threats Muslim Americans face today, especially with it being a new American religion? I'm like, yo, slow down. Islam is by no means a new American religion. Did you know that 15 to 30% of the enslaved African population in the antebellum South, in places like Arkansas, North Carolina, and Alabama, were actually Muslims? The first Muslim communities were enslaved communities. In addition to being the most diverse faith in this country, the history and legacy of Islam is deeply rooted within this country. Knowing that history is power. Knowing these facts and being able to throw them at individuals who throw these stereotypes and this misinformation at us, that is power. We also see the strides being had by the first Muslim American congresswomen in Washington, D.C. And they're facing an Islamophobia of an intense sort every day they report to work. My good friend Rashida Tlaib, also from Detroit, who I've known for a long time, if there's one person you don't want to mess with, let me tell you, it's Rashida. I've been on the other side of her anger on many occasions, and let me tell you, that's not a battle you can win. Also, Sister Ilhan from Minnesota, who's been the target of considerable demonization and vilification by not only the right, but also the left. Right? I think what makes me really proud standing here before you today is when I spoke to Sophia earlier today, she told me that Madina was a majority women-led board. We see women being our primary trailblazers in the seats of power nationally. That, to me, is a sign of not only communal transformation, but considerable forward movement for Muslim Americans at large. And I think most promising, and again, I'm a scholar, I'm a dork, I spend a lot of time by myself in the office writing and researching. I can remember, I'm old enough now where I remember a day when nobody cared about Muslim American civil rights issues. Nobody cared about Islamophobia. Nobody cared about what it was we were experiencing on a day-to-day basis. But in less than 5 years, Islamophobia has become a central, a cornerstone civil rights issue. I go to campuses across the country, and let me tell you, it's more common to see a non-Muslim student holding a sign against Islamophobia than it is a Muslim. So even though this administration has inflicted considerable harm against us and our community, it's also propelled our issues to the fore and to the center of this country's civil rights consciousness. And I think most beautiful, after New Zealand, we see a new brand of leadership, and ironically enough, a woman again, right? And I think there's something to be said about women being at the helm and being at the head of this transformation. Prime Minister of New Zealand, after that massacre, after that horrific tragedy, put Islamophobia on its head and said, I'm going to embrace this community. I'm going to be part of this community. And she led brilliantly and provided, I think, an example in an antithesis to what we see on an everyday basis from our president. I want to leave you with these words from a writer who I appreciate considerably, Palestinian writer by the name of Ghassan Kanafani. So my father, Lebanese, Allah yarhamu, he was jailed many times by the Israelis for a range of reasons. My dad was an activist, and my dad would always make me read Ghassan Kanafani when I didn't want to read. But I remember reading these words, and they really resonated and left an imprint in my mind. He wrote, "Everything in this world can be robbed and stolen except one thing. This one thing is the love that emanates from a community towards a conviction and toward a cause. Our conviction is greater than any other conviction. The Quran provides us with a roadmap for how to lead. And this country is at a crossroads to find its soul. We can actually emerge as Muslim Americans to be leaders to help this country identify and find its soul. The Constitution provides us with the tools, the instruments to make that happen. Dawah on a daily basis, and I love the words Sister Sophia mentioned earlier about radical inclusion. We're at most 10 million Muslims in this country, at most. We cannot afford to reject individuals from our house. We have to maximize our numbers and accept people for who they are and build our base and march ahead. Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking to every one of you, inshallah, tonight. Thank you.